Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on the History of AI podcast, and today I'm joined by Professor Bart Ehrman. And today we're discussing his new course titled The Earliest Christian Heresies. Join Dr. Bart Ehrman on November the 8th to the 9th for The Earliest Christian Heresies, 8 live lessons uncovering the faith's forgotten origins. You will learn many things in this course, including what believers thought about Jesus and everything else in the early centuries. Was Christ human, or divine, or both, or neither? Was there one God, two gods, 12, even 365? Was the creator of the world the same as the father of Jesus, or an evil, lower deity? Each group claimed to possess the true gospel and labeled the rest heretics. Out of their rival visions emerged the very questions that would define Christian belief for centuries about God, Jesus, creation, and what it means to be saved. Again, the live lessons are scheduled on November the 8th to the 9th from 2 to 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on both days. That's on a Saturday and a Sunday, again, November the 8th to the 9th. Each day includes 4 lectures plus a live Q&A. And if you purchase the course now, you get to enjoy early bird pricing for only $59.95 instead of $79.95. So you save $20. The early bird pricing lasts until October 26th. So if you want to save some money, if you want to save $20, purchase it now. Do not wait past October 26th. Other things that are included here is 8 50-minute lectures, we mentioned that earlier, 2 30-minute Q&As, we mentioned that earlier, and a bonus lecture, lecture slides, audiobook, and transcripts. So again, I just want to remind everybody, if you purchase it now, you get to enjoy early bird pricing, and it's only $59.95. The link to purchase the course will be in the description below and in the pinned comment. And that being said, Bart, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Can you tell the audience a little bit about what this course is about? I mean, it's about Christian heresies, but which heretical groups are you going to cover?
So it's going to be an 8-lecture course, and it's going to cover 3 major heresies of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. One of them is one that understands Christ to be divine but not human, Docetism, that we find traces of in the New Testament that going on beyond that. Another is Jewish Christianity. People think you still have to be Jews in order, or have to become Jews in order to be followers of Jesus. And then Gnosticism, third group. And for each of these groups, I'll be talking about what it is they believe, what they practiced, and what books they use to support their views. And then I'll talk about specific books for each one. And so part of this will be talking about the non-canonical books that support these various views.
Did they think that that Christ was divine, or he had a father, or that he was born? What did they believe that's different from Orthodox Christianity?
Well, that's the interesting thing about these 3 groups is they each had a different belief from each other and different from what became orthodoxy. In the Docetists are called that because from the word dokeo, which means to seem, and they thought that Jesus only seemed to be human. He was really God. He wasn't really human because God's not a human, and so he might have seemed like one, but he wasn't one. The Jewish Christian groups, the Ebionites, sometimes they're called, they had the opposite view. They thought that Christ was a human, and so he couldn't be God. And so they stress his humanity, but not his divinity. And then the Gnostics, they thought that Jesus Christ was 2 things. There was a man, Jesus, and there's a divine Christ, and they were temporarily united for Jesus' ministry. Starting at the baptism, the divine Christ came into Jesus, and then at the end of his life, he left Jesus before he died. And so you have these 3 groups of different things, and the Orthodox disagreed with all of them because they thought he was human, yes. He was divine, yes. And he was one person, not 2. And so they ended up with their understanding of Christ as this kind of mystery of being both divine and human.
Did they believe that there was a single God, or did they have more than one God, like 12 or even 365?
Again, depends which group you look at. The The Jewish Christians insisted on monotheism. There's only one God. Jesus is his son. He was adopted by God to be the son of God, but he's not God. There's only one God. Um, the Marcionites said, no, in fact, the God of Jesus is not related to the God of the Old Testament. He's not related to the Jewish God. The Jewish God is a God of wrath. Jesus represents a God of love. So they're literally two different gods, and they claim that Paul agreed with them on that. Um, the Gnostics, different Gnostic groups had different numbers of gods, but all of them had numerous gods in the divine realm. Uh, some of them had 12, some had 36. One group we do know about, as you mentioned, had 365 gods, and these are all divine elements up in the divine realm. And the Orthodox said, yes, there is one God, and Jesus is also God, but there's only one of them.
Was the creator of the world the same as the father of Jesus among these various groups? You just mentioned the Marcionites, and their
Yeah,
thoughts that
yeah,
Jesus isn't the son of the Old Testament God, but were there other groups like that as well?
yeah. So the Jewish Christians thought that Jesus was a human who that God had adopted to be his son, so he's the son of God, and then elevated him to heaven after his death, and so he has a kind of a he became he's more like he became a divinity. Sometimes that's called an adoptionist Christology, where God adopts Christ to be his son. Um, and yeah, so you get the two gods. You get the two gods in Marcion, and you get the multiple gods in in the Gnostic beliefs. But you have a number of groups that insist that the God who created this world cannot be the God of Jesus, because this world is awful. I mean, there's so much pain and misery here. So it isn't just it's not just the group that believes there are two gods, that doesn't think Jesus is the son of the demiurge. Many of the Gnostics also do not think that Jesus is related to the demiurge. Christ comes from the heavenly realm in order to save people from the demiurge in many of the Gnostic religions.
When do we get the first evidence of Christian heresies? Like how far back does this go?
Well, it depends how you define it, but it goes back to our earliest Christian writings, the writings of Paul. Paul didn't use the word heresy. It's not a New Testament word. But he does talk about other Christians who have false teachings. Um, you find this in a number of places in Paul's writings, probably with most vitriol in his letter to the Galatians, where Paul opposes a group of people who insist that following Jesus means you have to be a Jew. Jesus is from the Jewish God. He's Jewish. He's the Jewish Messiah. He fulfilled Jewish scripture. It's a Jewish religion. And so to be a follower of Jesus, you have to be Jewish. And Paul thought this was completely wrong. And he said that people subscribe to this view and act out on it, they're going to lose their salvation. And so, well, he doesn't use the word heretic, but that's what he means. I mean, so the word heretic itself, heresy, simply means choice. It's a Greek word that means choice. And in Christian thinking, it involves people who have chosen to believe the wrong things. So that happens as far back as Paul, and it continues on through the New Testament. Christians teaching false things into the second century, into the third, and down till today. But eventually, one group within Christianity emerged as the dominant view. They called themselves Orthodox, which means correct belief. And everyone who had a different belief was a heretic. They've chosen to believe the wrong things.
The What some of these groups believe kind of reminds me of what you see in Luke. I remember you brought up in previous discussions about Luke or having some having a theology that's kind of similar to adoptionism, like before the first two chapters were added
Mm-hmm.
about Jesus becoming the Son of God at the
Mm-hmm.
baptism.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, well, the interesting thing about all these groups is they could claim support from the books that did make it into the New Testament. Many of them had their own books as well, uh, claiming to be written by apostles, but they could appeal to the New Testament. And the Gospel of Luke is ripe for an adoptionistic view. So could Mark, in theory. And we know because in Luke, I mean, Jesus Jesus is said to become the Son of God at the baptism. And in the book of Acts, he's said to have become the Son of God at the resurrection. And so he seems to have become the Son of God at some point. And there are, so various groups could use various books. The books that said that Jesus was completely divine and not human, they could point to the Gospel of John, where it's clear. I mean, he's God on earth. He's God. And so the debates did center around, to some extent, the interpretations of books that became scripture.
And do you see links there between Luke's thoughts, Luke's theology there, and the Gospel of the Ebionites, which also has the Christ coming down on Jesus at the baptism and taking him over, possessing him, and then uh, at the baptism, becoming one?
So the it's a difficult thing talking about the Gospel of the Ebionites. I'll be talking about it in my course. There are three books that are called that are considered Jewish Christian Gospels, and there are debates about whether there are three of them, or one of them, or two of them, or more of them. It's really complicated to figure out because we only have quotations of them in church fathers. We don't have manuscripts of these books. Um, the Gospel of the Ebionites has have an extended baptism scene that in some ways is very interesting because again, I'll talk about this in the course, but in the three gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's a voice that comes from heaven when Jesus gets baptized. In Mark's gospel, the voice says, "You are my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased." In Matthew's gospel, it says, "This is my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased." And in the Luke, it's, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." Well, which did the voice say? The Gospel of Ebionites has it say all three things. First it says one, then it says the other, and then it says the third. Today I have begotten you. Well, if today is the day he's begotten him, as Luke appears to have said originally, yeah, that's adoptionistic. So, some of these Jewish Christians might have latched onto that book. You're muted,
Yeah.
Jacob.
No, I unmuted a moment ago.
Okay.
The the Gospel of the Hebrews is also another text that gets mixed up with the Gospel of the Ebionites. Some think it's the same text.
Yeah.
But what are the complications do you see in situations like that where is it really the same text? Can we really tell, or not really?
Well, we can tell, but there are different opinions about it. The There's been significant work on it by people who devoted decades to trying to figure it out. And the problem is that we have quotations in authors that talk about Jewish Christian Gospels, such as Jerome in the fourth, fifth century talks about these Christian Gospels, and he calls them different things at different times. And sometimes he'll call the same gospel different things. And sometimes he'll quote a gospel and say it's this gospel. It appears that he's quoting parts from different gospels. And it's like, oh my God, how do you work this out? But it looks like the Gospel of the Hebrews is a book that was used by Christians Jewish Christians in Egypt, and it seems to have kind of rough parallels to various kinds of Gnostic thinking. Um, and it can't. I don't think that it can be the Gospel of the Ebionites because it also has a baptism scene that is different from the one in the Gospel of the Ebionites. So we know of two Jewish Christian Gospels that have baptism scenes, but they're very different from each other. The third Gospel that people talk about is the Gospel of the Nazarenes, and that appears to be maybe possibly an Aramaic translation of the Gospel of Matthew, with some things changed. And so you've got one that's kind of a gospel harmony that's trying to put different gospels together. One that looks like it's leaning toward Gnosticism, and one that appears closest to something like a biblical Gospel of Matthew written in Aramaic. And so it's difficult to separate them all out, but there are people who've done this, and there's scholarship on it.
So to come back to the adoptionism specifically, since Luke seems to have that similarities to that theology, and even Mark, as you mentioned earlier, um, is that kind of evidence that there was a synoptic belief that the Christ became the Son of God, that Jesus became the Christ at the baptism. So this is like
Yeah.
really early. This is a really
Yeah.
early thought.
Yeah. I talk about this in a couple of my books. So I think why I argue in my book, The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, which deals with these various heretical groups and how they led to changes of the text of the New Testament, is that there's evidence from the book of Acts, oddly enough, that the earliest Christian view of all was an adoptionistic point of view. The book of Acts records gives several sermons from from Peter, from Paul, etc., throughout its text. And scholars have recognized that within these sermons, there appear to be portions of the sermons that are quoting earlier Christian beliefs. And these Christian beliefs that are being quoted regularly talk about Jesus becoming the Son of God, for example, at the resurrection, that God has made him Lord and Christ by raising him from the dead um, in the book of Acts. So, what scholars have long thought is originally what happened was when the Christians believed that Jesus was raised from the dead, so like soon after his death, as soon as people started thinking he was raised from the dead, they believed he'd been taken up to heaven. And in the ancient world, a human's taken to heaven is made a god. And so the earliest Christians appear to have thought that Jesus at his resurrection was made into a divine being. He was adopted then to be God's son. But over time, they started thinking, well, no, it was before that. It happened at his baptism. Then they started thinking, no, he was the Son of God from his birth. So they start telling stories of the virgin birth. Then they start saying, no, actually, he's always God. And so you get the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word. And so different groups have different theologies based on different understandings of things. Most of them can be traced back to the New Testament.
It's interesting that how an early thought, an early belief among the Christians, that even predates the Gospels, has become interpreted as heretical much later.
Yeah, that happens a lot in the history of heresy. It's a position that at one time is like the standard view is later declared a heresy. In our period, the period I'll be talking about, I won't be talking very much about the church father Origen, but in the early third century, he was the most important theologian of before Saint Augustine. I mean, for the first 300 years, he was the most important theologian, Origen, and in his view, he was the champion of orthodoxy. But because a lot of the views of Christianity hadn't been developed in detail, when he was developing some things in detail, he developed in ways that later came to be seen as problematic. And in the 6th century, he was declared a heretic, even though during his lifetime, he was the champion of orthodoxy. And so, similar with the New Testament, you have ideas in the New Testament that if somebody later propounded, they're declared a heretic.
I want to come back to the idea that Jesus is the son of a different God. How early, like, what is the earliest attestation? What is the earliest evidence of that belief, whether it's Marcionite or Gnostic, that we have? When did that come about?
Well, I think the first reference to it is is found in Irenaeus. So the difficulty we have with this kind of thing is that a lot of our evidence for these other groups comes from their opponents, the Orthodox opponents who wrote against them. And so we're not sure how accurate they are. And sometimes it doesn't look like they're very accurate. Sometimes they are accurate. So sometimes we don't know. Irenaeus is trying to trace the lineage of heretics. And he traces all forms of heretics back to this person who's mentioned in the book of Acts, Simon Magus, who has connections with the apostles in the book of Acts. Um, and he later comes to be declared as like the first heretic. And Irenaeus says about this figure, Simon Magus, that he understood that Christ was a human being who was temporarily inhabited by a divine being from above, and that so that he's not the son of God the way that Christians think that he is. And so that idea that Christ may be related to some other divine being or is inspired by some other divine being other than God the Creator kicks in early. So Simon Magus, if there was a Simon Magus, he would have been around, in the 40s or 50s. But this Irenaeus is writing in the 180s. And so my suspicion is that probably in the early 2nd century, there were people already saying this. And we have some indication of Gnostic thinking starting out about that time, 110, 120, right in there sometime.
So you think that it could be the case that Marcion is deriving his ideas from very early Gnostic groups that were already thinking along his lines about
No,
Jesus being the son of a distinct, more merciful God.
no, I don't think that. I don't think that there's any evidence that he's borrowing from the
Oh,
Gnostics
okay.
because when he was uh, Marcion used to be classified as a Gnostic, but his system is so different from the Gnostic system, as I'll be trying to show this in my course, that it doesn't look like he's been influenced by that. Marcion claims he's really influenced by Paul, and I think he's probably right because Paul emphasized that there's a difference between the law of the Old Testament, the law of God, and the gospel of Christ. And what Marcion does is he presses that distinction between the Old Testament law and the gospel of Jesus to an extreme to say that Jesus is not, he, he doesn't represent the God of the Old Testament. The God of the Old Testament tells the Israelites to go into Jericho and kill every man, woman, and child. That's not the God of Jesus. The God of Jesus says, turn the other cheek, love your enemy. So I think Marcion kind of reasoned it out from his differentiation between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And the Gnostics, I think, had a different basis. The basis of their multiple gods seem to be in more philosophical traditions that are developments of Platonic thought. Middle Platonism seems to be where they're getting their ideas from.
So therefore, you think that Marcion pretty much came up with his system independently, and he had a different idea about what he meant about the true God than
Yeah.
that of the Gnostics.
Yeah, because in Marcion, the God of the Old Testament is not evil. He's just. He's fair. He's given people a law. They break the law, so he punishes them. That's what justice is. So the problem isn't that he's evil. He's just and he's wrathful against people who break his law, and everybody breaks his law, so he's wrathful against everybody. But it's fair. He gave the law. He's supposed to keep it, as opposed to the Gnostic understanding, which the world was created by a really low-level divinity who's completely ignorant or evil, and so it's a different conception of who the divinity is.
So, so about his gospel, do you think that he abridged canonical Luke, or did he just choose a text that's shorter than Luke because it was closer to his theology?
We don't know. Marcion did have a gospel in his canon of scripture, and it was like our Luke. The church fathers who attacked Marcion said that he took our Luke and he cut it apart. He took out the parts that disagreed with his theology. Tertullian says he interpreted the gospel with a knife. So cut it off. Um, But there are reasons for thinking that actually he was simply using a gospel that was available to him in Sinope, where he grew up, which is in sort of it's on the southern coast of the Black Sea, so north central Turkey. He grew up there, and it may be the gospel that they knew there. It may well have been a form of Luke. Um, it may have been Luke itself, but it may have been a copy of Luke without the first two chapters because Marcion doesn't have those chapters. Since Marcion doesn't think that Jesus can come from the God who created this world, he doesn't have the first two chapters as Jesus being born to fulfill prophecy and God getting Mary pregnant. And so he didn't have those two chapters. The church fathers said he cut them out, but there are reasons for thinking maybe they weren't there originally and maybe he had a copy that didn't have them.
What do you think? What do you think caused Luke to eventually have those chapters? Was it an attempt to refute adoptionism?
Possibly. It would refute adoptionism because it would show that Jesus was born as the Son of God. It would also refute docetism, the idea that Jesus wasn't really human because he is born of a human mother. Um, and so there are various ways you could read it. We don't know how they got added. They must have got added very early if they weren't original because they're in all of our manuscripts. Um, and we don't know. I mean, it's possible that the author himself added them. The writing style is different from the rest of the book. It's very much more like an Old Testament style. It reads like an Old Testament story in many ways. And so it's possible that scribes wanted to add a birth story to Luke. Maybe they knew that Matthew had one, and so they added this one. It really, it's impossible to say. But I do incline to the idea that the original form of Luke started with what is now, it gave the first 4 verses where the author introduces himself and Theophilus. But then it picked up right at Matthew, right at John the Baptist's baptism, the way that the way that Mark does.
And do you think that in the earlier movement, because there's also different groups that have different beliefs about John the Baptist and how he's connected to Jesus, and they look at his authority differently, sometimes with more or maybe with less. Did John have more authority in within the adoptionistic view at all, or not really?
Um, we don't know of I don't think we know of groups that would identify as Christian who saw that John the Baptist had more authority than Jesus. We do have indications of, I'm talking about in the early centuries, we do have indications of groups of people who thought that John the Baptist was the Messiah, that he was the one who was sent from God. Um, and the New Testament itself seems to be combating that view. Uh, in the birth narratives, especially Luke's birth narrative, is combating that view. Um, all of them actually, Matthew, Mark, Luke, they're all trying to attack that view in some way. And in the book of Acts as well, what's that, chapter 19. So that there is evidence that there are people who thought John the Baptist was the one. Um, but we don't know groups that identified as followers of Jesus who thought that. Because if they thought John the Baptist was the one, they'd be following him.
What other Christian heresies do you think there's also evidence for being really early and like potentially pre New Testament?
Um, well, it's hard to say. I think that the book of First John is opposing a group of community members who have come to think that Jesus was not really a human being. And so this would have happened before the writing of First John. But First John is probably toward the end of the first century. So we don't know if this group would have been around before Paul's writings. I kind of doubt it. Um, the kinds of opponents that Paul attacks in uh, Galatians and a different group of Christians in Corinthians have views that were picked up by later groups. And it's not clear how well formed their views are. But like in Galatians, you have this idea that a person has to be Jewish and that it's a Jewish religion that gets picked up by Jewish Christians in the second and third centuries. In Corinthians, you have a large number of people in the church who think that Jesus was not physically raised from the dead, that it was a spiritual resurrection. And that may suggest a denigration of the material world, which is an idea that the Gnostics ran with, who also didn't think that Jesus was physically raised from the dead, some of them. So I think you have hints of these things early on. Whether there are full-fledged, like alternative ways of looking at things is hard to say.
What about different groups that had different views of the resurrection? I believe that Corinthus was thought to have a gospel in which the resurrection didn't even happen yet. Like it's a future event, and that the second coming of Jesus is his resurrection.
Yeah, well, there's already attested in the New Testament, there's a wide range of views, both about Jesus' resurrection and the resurrection of believers. And um, early on, um, you know, early on, virtually everybody agrees that Jesus got raised from the dead. And early on, almost everybody agreed that the end hasn't come yet. Both of those views end up getting changed over time. The problem with Cerinthus is that we don't have any of his writings. We have these church fathers who talk about him, and it's a little bit hard to know um, whether they're being accurate or not. And so there it is. I mean, part of the problem with understanding early Christian heresies is that for many of these groups, our principal sources are their enemies and who are lambasting them and who are mocking them, who are trying to show why they're problematic. And as we know from modern religion and politics, you can't really trust what the enemy has to say if you want to know what somebody's view is, because they're going to misrepresent it, either intentionally or unintentionally. So that's what makes it difficult. And so it's especially difficult with somebody like Cerinthus. It's become less difficult with some Gnostic groups because we actually have their writings, and so that's good. And you compare what they said with what the church fathers said about them, and sometimes the church fathers are faithfully representing them. Sometimes they're getting things wrong. Sometimes they're just making mistakes. But you can't do that with a number of the other groups.
From what you've seen, have the church fathers been, based on texts that we have of some of the heretical groups, have they been more accurate than not, or what?
So if you take Irenaeus as an example, because a lot of the later church fathers relied on what Irenaeus had to say, writing around year 180 or 185. When he gives a description of a Gnostic myth that is very close to what you get in the Apocryphon of John, the secret writing book of John that was discovered at Nag Hammadi, one of the Gnostic Gospels. His description is recognizably similar to that. And so it looks like there he's doing his best to actually give a solid description. But when he describes the ethics and the morality of Gnostic groups, it looks like he's just making stuff up because he talks about how licentious they are and their nocturnal orgies, and he's a little voyeuristic in places. And his idea seems to be that since the Gnostics believed that the spirit is what matters, that matter that matter is bad, and is people are trapped in their bodies. They're trapped in the prisons of their material selves. And the goal is to allow the spirit to escape. And the body is just going to cease to exist, but the spirit lives on in its heavenly realm. And so Irenaeus' logic was that for these Gnostics, the body doesn't matter. It's like it's going to be discarded. And since the body doesn't matter, Irenaeus reasoned, then it doesn't matter what you do with your body. And so to show your liberation from the body, you live a licentious life. So Irenaeus accused Gnostics of having that logic. And it turns out from the writings of Nag Hammadi, the Gnostic Gospels, we now know that he's wrong. That Gnostics actually had a different logic. They did think that the spirit does not matter, is what counted, not the body. But their logic was that means you should not be attached to your body. And the problem with physical pleasure is it attaches you to your body. You want more and more of it. And so Gnostics actually had the opposite morality. Their ethics were that you should punish your body so that you more readily escape it. And so these legends about nocturnal orgies and things are just that. They're legends. They're made up to attack an enemy rather than being accurate, apparently.
Just to remind everybody, the link to purchase earliest Christian heresies will be in the description below and in the pinned comment. And with that being said, Bart, thank you for joining me today.
Okay, thanks for having me.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.